The Specter of Communism in Hawaii, 1947 to 1953. Chapter 7, I Neither Deny Nor Affirm. The Reinecke case was the first tangible action in Governor Steinbach's war on communism. From the time the governor first felt betrayed by the ILWU during the 1946 election campaign, Steinbach had shown his willingness to utilize the communist issue against his foes. As the Truman administration became more stridently anti-communist, Steinbach associated himself with its efforts and eagerly displayed his anti-communist credentials. Thus, the territories case was deeply rooted in the policy of the federal government and was, to a significant degree, a reflection of the national mood. Having built a case around the testimony of two former communists, Louis Budens and Akiro Izuka, the territory then proceeded to offer exhibits designed to tie the Reinecke case into the national scene. First, President Truman's Executive Order 9835 was offered as evidence. This order established that the United States government could deny employment, or remove from employment, anyone who was in violation of the standards set forth in Part V of the order, which included membership in, affiliation with, or sympathetic association with any foreign or domestic organization, association, movement, group or combination of persons designated by the Attorney General as totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive, or as having adopted a policy of advocating or approving the commission of acts of force or violence to deny other persons their rights under the Constitution of the United States, or as seeking to alter the form of the government of the United States by unconstitutional means. This order established the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations, a copy of which was submitted as evidence by Ackerman. Executive Order 9835 also established the Loyalty Review Board, an agency within the Civil Service Commission, for the purpose of providing a final review of the decisions of departmental loyalty boards. Second, the territory offered as an exhibit a letter from the Attorney General of the United States dated May 27, 1947, concerning the Hatch Act and the Loyalty Review Board's relation to it. The Hatch Act, which regulated the political activities of federal employees, contained in Section 9 a requirement that any federal employee found to be a member of an organization declared subversive by the Loyalty Review Board must be dismissed. The last two territorial exhibits came from reports of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. The first made it clear that the committee wanted to dispel the idea that the Communist Party was a legitimate domestic political party. The second was the testimony of J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, before the committee on March 26, 1947. In tone and content, the Hoover testimony is characteristic of much of the anti-communist sentiment being heard throughout the nation, including the territory of Hawaii. The communist movement in the United States began to manifest itself in 1919. Since then, it has changed its name and its party line whenever expedient and tactical. But always it comes back to fundamentals and bills itself as the party of Marxism, Leninism. As such, it stands for the destruction of our American democracy. It stands for the destruction of free enterprise, and it stands for the creation of a Soviet of the United States and ultimate world revolution. The communists have been, still are, and always will be a menace to freedom, to the democratic ideals, to the worship of God, and to America's way of life. Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It spreads like an epidemic, and like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting the nation. The Reineckes, in their defense, called only one witness, Celeste Strack, for the purpose of dealing directly with the nature of communism. The defense chose to build its case around the Reineckes' character and reputation as teachers and as members of the community. The point was to prove that the Reineckes possessed the ideals of democracy and that their actions demonstrated that fact. The Reinecke hearing was unique among the anti-communist proceedings with which we are dealing in that the accused testified in their own behalf. Footnote: in the 1950 hearings of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, the so-called Reluctant 39 exercised their Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination when called as witnesses. In the Smith Act trial of 1952-53, none of the defendants took the stand. Footnote end. In the first 2 days of the Reinecke's defense, 15 character witnesses took the stand. A few examples will suffice to show the kind of testimony which was offered on behalf of the suspended school teachers. John C. Lewis, principal of Central Intermediate School, had known Eiko Reinecke since 1927-29 when they had worked together, and John Reinecke, casually, since 1936. Lewis told the commissioners, "I believe they are possessed of the qualities of democracy, and I say this, basing my judgment on the way they have lived their lives. I've never heard it stated anywhere that the Reineckes have been convicted of any crime. I have not heard it stated anywhere that the Ryuneckis were not good neighbors. I have not heard it stated anywhere that the Ryuneckis have not been good members of the community. On the contrary, I've heard that they've done a lot of good. I have known for a fact that they have helped others under unfortunate circumstances. Edith Keene, a student counselor at Farrington High School since 1943, first knew John Ryunecki in the 1920s when he was teaching on the Big Island. She told the commissioners a long story relating to Ryunecki's ability as a teacher and decency as a man. She concluded, "I can say quite emphatically that Dr. Ryunecki is one of those rare teachers who has no problem children but is able to discover children with problems in his classes. There's quite a difference. I know of no class cutting of his classes, no disciplinary problems in his classroom. At all times have his classes proceeded in an orderly fashion, democratically conducted, and yet he is known as a teacher who makes his students work and produce." Louis Inagaki and Richard Hurakami were students of John Ryunecki's at the time of his suspension. They took the lead in circulating a petition in Ryunecki's behalf. At the hearing, Louis spoke of Ryunecki as unbiased and unprejudiced. He said that Ryunecki was a good teacher because he respected the students. Richard said simply, "He was the best teacher I've ever had," a sentiment echoed by Thomas Suzuki, a former student of Ryunecki's at Kawakawa Intermediate School. Thomas told of how, when he was forced to drop out of school due to illness, Ryunecki had brought him library books during his convalescence. He also told how Ryunecki had bought both his ticket to the 9th grade graduation banquet and his class picture when his family was unable to afford it. Maxi Santiago, the next defense witness, was a bellboy at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. He told of problems he had been having with his daughter, Simone, who had taken to stealing. Santiago, a father of 5, then told how Eiko Ryunecki, Simone's teacher at Waiale Elementary School, had helped his daughter overcome her problem. "What she taught my daughter in 6 months," Santiago told the commissioners, "I couldn't do it in 6 years." Hisayuki Sakaguchi, an insurance agent, told how his daughter, Yukino, had been a student in Eiko Ryunecki's class at Waiale School in 1942. Sakaguchi had been president of the PTA and found Eiko Ryunecki the most helpful teacher in the school. When Sakaguchi went into the army for 3 years, Eiko continued to be helpful. Mrs. Ryunecki made it a point, Sakaguchi testified, to see to it that at least my daughter wrote to me regularly while I was in the army, and in those letters she wrote and said how much Mrs. Ryunecki tried to ease the separation, and that she took both my daughter and my son to the beaches, to picnics. She even went to personal expense getting photographs of the children taken and sent to me. Mrs. Juliette Valenti, a taxi driver and a mother of 6, told the commissioners that her son, Abraham, had been in Eiko Ryunecki's class at a time when the family was having serious difficulty. Abraham had been sent to the Salvation Army home and had, when he most needed it, received the loving attention of his teacher. When Abraham read about the Ryunecki case, Mrs. Valenti said, "Her son had come to her and insisted that she help Mrs. Ryunecki as much as I can if I do love him." The most dramatic testimony about Eiko Ryunecki came from Mrs. Ito Isasaki. There were 8 children in the Isasaki family. Eiko Ryunecki had touched deeply the life of Mrs. Isasaki's daughter, Martha, who had been one of her students. One summer, Mrs. Isasaki said, "My daughter was very sick and her fever won't come down for 2-3 days. She had 103 temperature. But Mrs. Ryunecki sent a postcard from Mexico and I showed to my daughter the card. She even can't open her eyes to look the card, but she hugged the card, and then the fever was off. When 3 o'clock came she had no fever, she was all well." Eiko Ryunecki also provided timely help for Mrs. Isasaki's son, Kiyoshi. When Kiyoshi had a scrape with the law, Eiko Ryunecki helped him to obtain legal assistance. Deputy Attorney General William Blatt asked who had been obtained as legal counsel for the boy. Simmons stipulated that it had been Simmons and Bauslag, without fee. Blatt's ungracious response was, "Congratulations, you will find your reward in heaven, counsel." Counsel for the territory of Hawaii was growing restive under the line of testimony which has been described here in its barest outlines. Nor was the community without its skeptics. The following letter from John Blanding Mason of Wahiawa illustrated that fact. It was printed in the Honolulu Advertiser. "I am following very closely the newspaper accounts of the Ryunecki trial. It would not be just to assume that all these wonderful things done by the Ryuneckis were not done out of pure charity or at least through natural humanitarianism. However, the pattern seems so typically read that one is almost forced to doubt the Ryuneckis' sincerity. May I strongly urge the readers of this letter to obtain a copy of the July 1948 issue of The American and read the article entitled, "The Reds Are After Your Child," by Harry Gideons, LLD, President of Brooklyn College, New York. In this article, speaking about the communists in our American public schools, Mr. Gideon says, they have a thorough understanding of young people and know just how to go about winning their sympathies, and they know how to exploit the weaknesses of our educational organizations. Having made the point that there were those in the community who admired, even loved, the Reinekis for their seemingly selfless acts as good teachers and good neighbors, the defense turned its efforts to the destruction of Akiro Izuka's testimony. It was not difficult to show that Izuka had testified erroneously at a number of points, but the sheer bulk of his testimony and the plausibility of much of it made him a difficult witness to dismiss easily. The legal dictum, falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus, merely means that if a witness is proven to have given false testimony in one area, the remainder of his testimony may, not must, be doubted. The first rebuttal witness, Constantine Sampson, was dismissed without being allowed to testify because he had been present at some earlier sessions of the Reineki hearing. He was prepared, had he been allowed to testify, to contradict some of Izuka's testimony relating to the ILW Unity Conference at Hilo in January 1948. Next was Masaru Shimonishi of Hanapepe, Kauai. He and Izuka had been children together. Both were involved in the organization of ILWU Local 135 at Kauai terminals in 1937. Shimonishi was the president of the local for 4 years, during 3 of which Izuka was vice president, 1938 to 41. Shimonishi contradicted Izuka's testimony on the character of a labor dispute at Port Allen in 1938. Izuka had called it a strike and had said that it was dictated to the local by Jack Hall. Shimonishi said it was a lockout and that Hall, although he supported the union men, had nothing to do with the basic decisions made by the local. These, Shimonishi insisted, had been democratically arrived at among the membership. Shimonishi also testified that Izuka had developed a reputation for having wild ideas by the latter part of 1938 and in 1939. He brought up an allegation, to which Blatt objected vehemently, that Izuka had been suspended for 1 month from Kauai terminals in 1935 for pilfering cargo. Shimonishi also indicated that both before and after Pearl Harbor, Izuka had been behind a deliberate attempt to slow down on the job. We even had to call meetings, Shimonishi testified, to tell Mr. Izuka, who was vice president of the union, not to read pamphlets during working hours regardless of the cargo coming down on his head. Shimonishi did not explain why his democratically operated union did not elect another vice president. The next witness was Samuel K. Stevens of Hilo. Stevens, a supervisor for Hawaiian Telephone Company, had formerly been a member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 1357, AFL, and in 1946 was co-chairman of the Political Action Committee on the Big Island. He rebutted Izuka's testimony, which had characterized a PAC meeting he attended as a Communist Party meeting. The 20th defense witness was Gesto de la Cruz, Oahu vice president of ILWU Local 142. He testified that Izuka's challenge to the accuracy of the ILWU's minutes for the Hilo Unity Conference was not justified. De la Cruz conceded that Izuka's remarks had been condensed in the minutes, which the union had released, but that his full remarks were on file at the ILWU office for any union member to read. This testimony came as a surprise to Meyer Simmons, who admitted that he was unaware that Izuka's remarks had been condensed in the minutes. It was not a particularly consequential matter, but it did serve to make the defense look bad. The final rebuttal witness to deal with the Izuka testimony was Tony Kunimura of Kauai. Kunimura testified that he had first met Izuka in October 1946, shortly after the primary elections. Izuka had convinced Kunimura to support William Borthwick in the general election. The second time he saw Izuka, the testimony continued, was at the home of Ed Berman. At this meeting, Kunimura said Izuka had called Jack Hall a labor racketeer who wanted only power and didn't give a damn for working people. Kunimura swore that Izuka continued with the assertion that Ed Berman was more responsible in building the ILWU in the territory than anybody else, and that Jack Hall should be removed as international representative here. Ed Berman was then alleged to have entered the conversation with the comment that Jack Kawano was just a stupid labor racketeer too and he just wanted power. Berman then supposedly continued to praise Izuka as a more capable labor leader who should be leading the longshoremen. Kunimura was obviously trying to describe a mutual admiration society consisting of Akiro Izuka and Ed Berman, the purpose of which was to replace Jack Kawano and Jack Hall as leaders in the ILWU. If the existence of such a cabal could be proven, it would obviously place the Izuka pamphlet and the Izuka testimony in the Reineki case in a very bad light. Tony Kunimura's testimony certainly raised the question, but it probably proved nothing. There is a great deal of conflicting testimony on exactly what it was that Ed Berman wanted when he returned to Hawaii from California at the end of World War II. Berman has told the author that he merely wanted to practice law in Hawaii. John Rienecke has indicated two possibilities. First, that Berman expected to handle the legal work for the ILWU and that he was bitter because Meyer Simmons and Harriet Bauslag were brought to Hawaii for that purpose. And second, that Berman saw himself in Jack Kawano's position in the Longshore Union. Rienecke described a scene in which Berman allegedly sought his support in replacing Jack Kawano. Berman, according to Rienecke, stopped him on the street and said, "Jack Kawano and McElrath have no use for you because you are an intellectual. They say, comes the revolution, Rienecke will run like a rabbit, pissing in his pants at every step. But there is a place for us intellectuals. Don't you agree? I can work all day on the waterfront and then write a pamphlet. Can Kawano do that?" Footnote, Rienecke hearing, September 14, 1948, page 55. From a letter by John and Eiko Rienecke to their friends, dated December 27, 1947. This is one of a series of annual letters, but the only one to be found in a public document. It was read in its entirety into the transcript of the Rienecke hearing and appears as Appendix B at the conclusion of this work. Footnote end. The author is convinced that Ed Berman was the most significant single influence Iizuka had during the period when the Kauai longshoreman was deciding to leave the Communist Party and assume a vigorously anti-communist stance. What, if anything, Berman expected to gain from his efforts is difficult to say. Berman was, and continues to be, a very intense and complex man. It would be a disservice to the man and to history to attempt to speculate excessively on his motivations. Clearly, the direct testimony of Tony Kunimura was designed to show that Iizuka was behaving in a personally selfish manner under the influence of Berman. In cross-examination, Deputy Attorney General Blatt attempted to show that Tony Kunimura's testimony was self-serving. Tony's brother, Robert, was vice president of the Kauai division of ILWU Local 142 and one of those named by Iizuka as a member of the Communist Party. Until his move back to Kauai from Oahu, Tony Kunimura had been very active in the Hawaiian Civil Liberties Committee, HCLC, and had worked personally on behalf of the Rieneckes. What was more, Blatt revealed, Tony Kunimura had been brought to Honolulu to testify in the Rienecke case at HCLC expense. When asked by Blatt whether he or his brother were members of the Communist Party, Kunimura refused to answer. The defense sought to counter the testimony of Louis Budens with that of Celeste Strack, the 33-year-old educational director of the Communist Party in California. Strack, a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Southern California, was awarded a Master of Arts degree in economics by the University of California at Los Angeles. She had a long record in the communist movement dating back to 1933 when she joined the Young Communist League. Her task in Hawaii was to discuss her job, which she held openly, in such a way that the Communist Party label could free itself of some of the odium with which it had been invested by the party's enemies. Strack's testimony was impressive but seemed not to have won any converts for the Rieneckes among the commissioners. To some observers, her mere presence was an affront and a confirmation of every suspicion they held against the Rieneckes. Louis Budens had testified that Communist Party publications were given absolutely no freedom of expression. They did nothing more than reflect the party line. Strack took issue with that viewpoint, citing examples of her own work which was published in party organs. "I could not claim," she contended, "that the articles I had written were the official expression of the party's viewpoint." Strack went on to assert that a close examination of party publications, particularly the theoretical journal, Political Affairs, would reveal a significant amount of open debate among members of the Communist Party. In cross-examination, the debate over freedom of expression within the Communist Party ran into the theoretical issue of democratic centralism, an issue with which we will not wrestle here, but an issue which shows that when different people use the same term, in this case democracy, they may mean something very different from one another. Strack went on to testify about social issues within the mainstream of American political life which had been, according to her, the primary object of Communist Party activity in the United States. The party had supported Social Security, unemployment insurance, anti-lynching laws, anti-poll tax legislation, price supports, and the cause of the underprivileged in general. It had opposed the Taft-Hartley Act and the proposed Mont-Nixon bill. Strack's testimony was then directed to the role of the Communist Party in organized labor in the United States, the defense dealing with the difficult phrase, the class struggle, head-on. Here, the Young California Party official utilized an analogy to depict the position of the communists. One may observe an earthquake and state that there is an earthquake or that an earthquake is liable to occur under certain conditions, but that doesn't mean that one is advocating earthquakes. On the even more volatile issue of the inevitability of force and violence, Strack quoted from the Constitution of the Communist Party of the United States as follows: "Any member shall be expelled from the party who is found to be a strikebreaker, provocateur, one who advocates force and violence or terrorism, or who adheres to or participates in the activities of any group or party which conspires or acts to subvert, undermine, weaken, or overthrow any or all institutions of American democracy through which the majority of the American people can maintain their right to determine their destinies to any degree. She went on to cite a specific case in which a Communist Party member named Humphreys had been expelled for just such a cause. A substantial part of Strack's testimony consisted of introducing into the record quotations by communists which were directly contradictory of those offered by Louis Budens. Her efforts pointed out the difficulty in a hearing which sought to measure the motives of the accused by the words of others. It was a difficulty which afflicted virtually all such proceedings in the United States during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Footnote: Attorney Gladstein attempted to show the deficiency of the literary proceeding by quoting passages from the Casa Editorial de Arte Católico. This anti-liberal Spanish catechism supported state censorship because the government must prevent the deception, calumny, and corruption of its subjects, which harm the general good. It warns that a man should not buy a liberal paper because he contributes his money to evil, places his faith in jeopardy, and gives others a bad example. The document concluded with the warning, do not read any newspaper without the previous consultation and approval of your confessor. Gladstein pointed out that to hold all Roman Catholics responsible for such writing would be both an absurdity and an injustice. Similarly, to hold any communist responsible for the utterances of another would be equally untenable. Footnote end. Celeste Strack's appearance in Hawaii had an impact far beyond her performance before the Commissioners of Public Instruction. This was due to her participation in a speaking tour of the outer islands under the sponsorship of the Hawaiian Civil Liberties Committee. The purpose of the tour was to generate popular support for the Reinekis and to show the people that an open, practicing communist was not some kind of monster. Strack was given a generally friendly reception from the people she met and a generally bad reception by the press. The Honolulu Star-Bulletin, which had been regularly chided by its morning rival, the Advertiser, for failing to come to grips with the communist issue, sent the following telegram to Roger N. Baldwin, director of the American Civil Liberties Union in New York. Hawaii Civil Liberties Committee announces that it is sponsoring a territorial tour by Miss Celeste Strack, who is Education Director of the Communist Party of California. Miss Strack was brought here as a defense witness on behalf of Dr. and Mrs. John E. Reinecki, public school teachers suspended on charges they were Communist Party members, have communist leanings and associations, and do not possess democratic ideals essential to school teachers. No concealment whatever that Miss Strack is Communist Party member. In fact, she so testified under oath before the Territorial School Board which is holding the hearings. Has Civil Liberties Committee of Hawaii any connection or affiliation with the Civil Liberties Union? Does Civil Liberties Union approve or oppose speech tours by avowed communists under auspices of civil liberties organizations? 23. Baldwin's reply to the Star Bulletin appeared in the same edition of the paper. Replying to your telegram, the Hawaiian Civil Liberties Committee is only tentatively affiliated with the American Civil Liberties Union, pending completion of its personnel. We would not affiliate any organization taking a political partisan position or engaging in partisan activities. The proposed tour of a communist official by the Civil Liberties Committee is entirely out of line with our principles and practices. Whatever its purpose, the impropriety of such a relationship would be obvious, particularly in connection with an educational case whose interest for defenders of civil liberties is solely one of principle. No communist is in a position to defend any such case on principle, or, indeed, any principles of civil liberties. Footnote, source, Honolulu Star Bulletin, September 14, 1948, page 1. The issue of communism was one which caused great debate within the American Civil Liberties Union. Beginning in 1940, after the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, the issue divided the membership. In that year, the ACLU Board of Directors voted 10-9 to expel Elizabeth Gurley Brown, an avowed communist, from her position on that body in spite of the organization's traditional opposition to the concept of guilt by association. After World War II, the ACLU's anti-communism intensified to the point that by 1953 the Board of Directors modified the membership application to read that only those whose devotion to civil liberties is not qualified by adherence to communist, fascist, KKK, or other totalitarian doctrine were welcome to join. This reference to communism was found to be offensive to a majority of the membership by a vote of 21,271 to 18,995. In spite of this referendum vote, the Board of Directors voted 14-4 to retain the language on the basis of a power which had earlier been extended to the board by the membership. For a valuable discussion of the ACLU and the communist issue, see the chapter by Mary S. McAuliffe on that organization contained in Robert Griffith and Athan Theoharis, The Specter, pp. 154-70. It was from this source that the information in this footnote was derived. Footnote end. Stephen Murin, the president of the Hawaii Civil Liberties Committee, was infuriated by the exchange between the Star Bulletin and Roger Baldwin. In a letter to the editors of the Star Bulletin, Murin vented his anger. After reading your article, I have arrived at these conclusions. 1. You have attempted, by wiring the American Civil Liberties Union, to confuse the issues involved in this case. 2. You have attempted to create the impression that the Hawaii Civil Liberties Committee is an affiliate of the ACLU and that the HCLC has encouraged the impression. This is not the case. By consulting with any active member or officer of the HCLC, you could have ascertained the truth. Regarding your quoted reply from the ACLU, I wish to point out that the ACLU had a long and respected record for work in its field. Because of its valuable work in defense of minorities, it too earned the hatred of the most reactionary sections of the press. After years of red-baiting attacks, the leadership of the Civil Liberties Union surrendered to the baiters' pressure and dismissed the communist members of its own board of directors. This fact must have been known to you. As a man of intellect, you knew that it is unnecessary to wire an organization that forbids communists to sit on its board of directors to find out if that organization would sponsor a tour by a Communist Party official. The decision to send Miss Strack to the outer islands to speak on her organization's position on civil liberties was made at a membership meeting held September 7. The membership of our committee has as much right to sponsor such a series of forums as had the members of the Republican Club, who exercised their right to have Miss Strack speak on their forum last Friday evening. Strack had her own reaction to press criticism of her tour. It appears, she wrote in a letter to the Advertiser, that certain elements in Hawaii believe that such debates and discussions represent too much democracy and are prepared to oppose any opportunity for a frank statement by the Communist Party. Strack concluded with a warning: if they are prepared to deny the right of free speech to the Communist Party, which is a legal political party, they are also capable of restricting or denying that same right to others with whom they disagree. The editor's comments left no doubt about what the Advertiser thought of Strack in her letter. The Advertiser has no apologies, Celeste, to make for anything it has said, or may say in the future, against communism or communists. It is a mockery for a communist to even mention democracy. While argument raged over the propriety of Strack's tour, the Rienecki hearing moved on. The defense had only 2 witnesses left, John and Eiko Rienecki. John Rienecki was the first to take the stand. Meyer Simmons led John Rienecki through a biographical discussion of his life, showing how a young man from Kansas came to Hawaii and made it his home. It showed something of the intellectual development of a young teacher with vaguely socialist leanings who confronted life on a variety of different levels. As a school teacher in a plantation economy, as a sociology student in a Chinese university at Peiping, as the young husband of a Japanese-American wife, as a returning visitor to the mainland United States during the depths of the Depression of the 1930s, as a tenacious student who earned a Master of Arts degree at the University of Hawaii in summers and so attracted a visiting Yale professor that he was given a scholarship to do graduate study and earn a doctorate in the sophisticated intellectual environment of New Haven, as a radical young instructor at the University of Hawaii whose outspoken commitment to controversial issues caused him to be let go, as a volunteer who gave freely of his time to aid the cause of organized labor in Hawaii, and finally, as a man who had returned to teaching in the public schools only to be suspended for lacking the ideals of democracy necessary to retain a position of such trust. Meyer Simmons provided the backdrop for an exposition of John Rienecki's political philosophy. The most important part of John Rienecki's testimony was a textual analysis of the so-called plan of the communists. His 1935 paper entitled What Must We Do?, to which Governor Steinbach had referred in his Armistice Day speech in 1947, Governor Steinbach had quoted only a small portion of Rienecki's 13-year-old effort, written shortly before John Rienecki went to Yale to study for his doctorate. The portion which Steinbach used was, without question, the weakest and most assailable part. Simmons sought to place it in proper context. The document was essentially a reflection of John Rienecki's concern about the conditions he perceived during his teaching days at Honoka'a, on the island of Hawaii, and about the harsh realities of plantation life in Hawaii, generally, in the 1930s. John Rienecki was, by 1935, at least a theoretical Marxist. He was troubled by a pamphlet entitled Hawaii, A Story of Imperial Plunder, by Samuel Weinman. While he agreed with the Marxist orientation of the work, he was disturbed by the many errors of fact and interpretation he found in it. Weinman had never been to Hawaii and was deeply burdened by some stereotypes which had been put into his mind by some very superficial writing done in the 1920s by the Japanese Marxist, Sen Katayama. John Rienecke testified that his concern over the Weinman pamphlet led him to engage in correspondence with the author and even to visit him in New York while traveling to New Haven. It also led him to write What Must We Do, in order to straighten out my own thinking, such as it was then, on the subject of Hawaiian social, political, and economic structure, and how, in my opinion, it should be changed. John Rienecke testified that at the time he wrote What Must We Do, he knew no communists nor anyone he had reason to believe might be a communist. He stated that he might have sent carbon copies to two friends in Honolulu, Kenneth Sano and John K. Akau, Jr., men he had met in Honolulu during the summer of 1934, but the idea that the document could be looked upon as a Communist Party directive seemed ludicrous to him. Furthermore, John Rienecke testified he had not seen a copy of What Must We Do for 13 years. Footnote: in interviews with John K. Akau Jr. on February 9 to 10, 1975, the author found corroboration for John Rienecke's speculation that Governor Steinbach had received his copy of What Must We Do from Akau. Akau described himself as a fellow traveler in the 1930s, but was most emphatic about the fact that he had never been a member of the Communist Party. Akau also supports John Rienecke's contention that there was no Communist Party in Hawaii in 1935. Akau asserted that Steinbach had misrepresented What Must We Do in his 1947 Armistice Day speech for reasons of political expediency. Footnote end. The first section of What Must We Do dealt with the matter of creating militant industrial unions in the areas of sugar and pineapple for the purpose of dominating those industries. John Rienecke commented in his hearing before the Commissioners of Public Instruction that statement I should have to change very materially because of the word domination. At that time, I had a very vague idea of the functioning of trade unions and of the limitations of trade unions, particularly within our capitalistic economy. Next, the document dealt with practical matters such as an 8-hour day, a 44-hour week, overtime pay, and a guarantee of the right to organize. Rienecke pointed out that, at the time he wrote, the mills were on a 12-hour day, there was no overtime pay, and the so-called Little Wagner Act had not yet been passed in Hawaii. Section 2 of What Must We Do dealt with the matter of organizing the subsidiary industries and the development of class consciousness to replace both inter- and intra-racial prejudices which stood in the way of union organization. John Rienecke indicated that he would have changed little in that section were he writing it in 1948. Section 3 dealt with the matter of racial antagonisms at greater depth. At one point there was a mention of the Radical Labor Party of Hawaii, a reference that obviously called for some explanation. At this time, John Rienecke told the commissioners, I don't really know exactly what I meant. To the best of my recollection, I must have had in mind a labor party in opposition to the political control of the islands by the Big Five. I don't think I had any concrete ideas what form it should take. Further reading in the document supports John Rienecke's testimony here. In Section 7, the concluding section of What Must We Do, it was tentatively suggested that it might have been desirable to organize a radical political party aiming to drive the Democrats and Republicans together and so expose their identity. When questioned as to whether he would still favor such a party, John Rienecke replied with seeming candor, I would not be opposed, certainly, to having a truly radical political party, that is to say, a Marxist party operating here, but I fear that it would not draw very many votes. One reason for that, he explained, was that the Democratic Party had, in recent years, become morally and financially independent of the Republican Party. Section IV of What Must We Do continued the theme of racial disharmony within the ranks of labor, a theme which troubled John Rienecke deeply as a student of Hawaii's labor history. Section V moved into more sensitive territory for a teacher who was under the kind of suspicion which John Rienecke faced in 1948. It dealt with the youth of Hawaii and their lack of awareness about the economic and political movements of the world. Every effort should be made, John Rienecke had written, to bring them to a full class consciousness, to read understandingly and to see where they stand. Radical literature should be distributed and a book stand established in Honolulu. Probably, as soon as possible, a newspaper should be established to express radical views. Again, John Rienecke's candor in analyzing this section of What Must We Do is remarkable. The first sentence, I think, was quite true at the time, and I should say that it is, to some extent, true today, although it is my impression that the young people of Hawaii are somewhat more aware of what is going on in the world than they were then. Now, as for the second sentence, as I said at the time that I wrote this, I considered myself a Marxist, although I had a very imperfect idea of what Marxism was. I still consider myself one. I consider that socialism is a goal which should be striven for, and therefore I still subscribe to the idea that young people should be brought to full class consciousness. The remainder of John Reinecke's explanation of the passage was lost in the resounding echo of the admission he had just made. He qualified his view on radical literature to read as progressive in general. He qualified his statement on a radical newspaper to the point where he was making a general plea for competition in the marketplace of ideas. But he had said he was a Marxist and that he felt that young people should be brought to full-class consciousness. While it may be possible to admire the candor of the statement, it is equally possible to question the wisdom of it, under the circumstances. The next paragraph was of no more help to John Reinecke than the last. He spoke of close contacts between Hawaiian comrades and mainland centers. John Reinecke explained weakly, presumably I meant by Hawaiian comrades, people in Hawaii who were militantly in favor of building up a radical labor movement. So far as I knew then and so far as I know at present, there were, in Hawaii, in 1935 no members of a socialist or socialist labor or communist party, the three parties which, I believe, used the word comrade in referring to their members. Section V, the section quoted by Governor Steinbach, was the part with which the John Reinecke of 1948 took the greatest exception to the ideas of the John Reinecke of 1935. At that time, my ideas were very immature. One can see that a number of points below have little or no relevance to the building of a strong, shall we call it anti-monopoly or anti-big business movement in Hawaii, so that much of what follows I would consider now has no place in any such movement and would not represent my views at present. John Reinecke testified that his experience teaching at McKinley High School had taught him that the ROTC, which he had attacked in 1935, could be a useful institution. With regard to the question of the military in general, John Reinecke pointed out that What Must We Do was written shortly after the infamous Massey rape case, which had led a powerful group of local citizens quietly to support a move by the United States Navy to replace what representative government then existed in Hawaii with government through a military commission. John Reinecke's 1948 view was that a military presence in Hawaii was acceptable as long as the military remained subordinate to the civilian government. John Reinecke explained that his opposition to the National Guard in the 1930s was tied to the manner in which Guard units were used as strikebreakers. He indicated that he no longer held this view since this particular use of the National Guard seemed to have ended. John Reinecke admitted his concern over the militarization of the Boy Scouts was really rather silly, adding that he had served as a scoutmaster from 1927 to 28 while teaching at Kona Waina School on the Big Island. John Reinecke stood behind his 1935 observations on education in Hawaii, offering a long explanation which is, essentially, outside the scope of this work. But one point he made about education came very much within the area of scrutiny in the case at hand. It is highly important, he had said, to win the teachers and university and high school students. John Reinecke's explanation of that statement follows. I thought that teachers and university and high school students would see rather clearly how the welfare of Hawaii, democracy in Hawaii, were held back by the big businessmen. Today, I am not at all so hopeful that they can be brought to see that. Nevertheless, I should say that any labor or progressive group should aim at winning teachers and university and high school students to at least see their point of view, and that the point of view of the labor unions should be presented just as fully and effectively in the schools as the point of view of big business. John Reinecke also defended his paragraph on civil rights, though he was critical of his own lack of understanding at the time What Must We Do was written. The shortness of that paragraph shows my ignorance of conditions. If I knew as much then as I know today about the history of repression of civil liberties in Hawaii, I could have written several pages instead of 3 lines. At the time I wrote this, picketing was absolutely forbidden by one of the most stringent anti-picketing laws on the books of any state or territory. I think that Fortune magazine characterized it as penalizing anyone who lurked about any establishment with the idea in his mind of picketing. That has since been repealed, thanks to the pressure of organized labor. Regarding his 1935 attack on organized religion, John Reinecke said that by 1940 he had come to the realization of the useful purposes which the religious institutions played in the lives of people. While making a strong plea for freedom of conscience and separation of church and state, John Reinecke praised some of the social work done by the Buddhist religious organizations with the Japanese and the Catholic Church with the Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, and Portuguese. John Reinecke deemed his section on taxation and social legislation all right as far as it goes, adding that its brevity shows my ignorance at that time. Regarding his statement about the danger of the sugar-coated press, John Reinecke responded simply, "Well, I don't think that I need to add anything to that. At the beginning of the second day of John Reinecke's testimony, when the textual analysis of what must we do was only partially completed, Myers-Simmons fed John Reinecke a question that allowed him to make a statement on how the document had been misused. The governor's charge that it was a plan for the communists of Hawaii is preposterous and a complete lie. It has absolutely no foundation. This document, which he terms the plan, is a plan only in the sense that Moore's utopia and Bellamy's looking backward are plans. It was an intellectual exercise, wishful thinking. Had the governor, instead of seizing upon the document with the opportunism of an irresponsible politician, examined it critically as a man who has been a judge might be expected to, he would have seen from its form and content that it was written in an organizational vacuum. Governor Steinbach has acted dishonorably in meanly using this writing as he has done, first to create odium against me, second, to slander the Communist Party, third, to aid the enemies of statehood for Hawaii. The Attorney General, Dr. Loper, and the Commissioners of Public Instruction must also bear a share of the blame. First, the governor foisted upon the Communist Party a document in which it had no part. At this point, Chairman Edward N. Silva broke into John Reinecke's prepared statement, asking, "Would you mind telling us whether you are a communist or not?" Myers-Simmons registered strong objection both to Silva's question and his interruption. After the dust had settled, John Reinecke continued reading his prepared statement, beginning at the exact point where he had been interrupted, and of which it was ignorant in order to create odium against it. Then, he or Mr. Ackerman indicated me to the press as author of the supposed plan, but without naming me, so that I had no way of coming forward to explain the document. Finally, when odium had already been aroused against the unnamed author of the manuscript, Dr. Loper filed charges against me based in part on my presumed authorship and the odium arising from its exposure. Mr. Steinbach, Mr. Ackerman, Dr. Loper, or the commissioners could have confronted me with the document at any time and asked me for an explanation, and I would have been glad to tell them the truth of the matter. Had any of these persons given me an opportunity to explain what the document was and the circumstances under which it was written, before the Armistice Day speech was delivered or the charges against me were drawn, I should never have had to face much of the odium which I have faced from certain uninformed persons during the past 10 months. 1 week after my suspension, on December 1st, I pointed out in the Star Bulletin that Mr. Steinbach's speech contained long and specific charges against one individual whom he was not man enough to name but who was later identified by the press as myself. The governor did not answer my statement or seek to discover if he had been mistaken or misled. To have done so would have deprived him of an effective if dishonorable weapon. Instead, he distributed copies of the document. One was reprinted in a local magazine, Hawaiian Digest, March 1948. Another was used by Mr. Norborne Smith of the Spearhead for Americanism in his forum addressed to the women. Mr. Steinbach sent a third copy to Lieutenant Governor Arthur W. Coolidge of Massachusetts, who used it over a national hookup to harm Hawaii and to help create anti-Russian war hysteria by making it the basis of his fantastic statements. Finally, I am informed that Senator Hugh Butler used this same document, this same communist plan in quotes, to help kill the statehood bill. Mr. Steinbach and Mr. Coolidge have illustrated perfectly how a Red Scare can be built up from a basis of pure imagination. Having thus offended the governor of the territory of Hawaii as well as the commissioners of public instruction, John Reinecke turned to a more positive exposition of his views. He now offered a statement by the American Law Institute, running to 18 articles, entitled Statement of Essential Human Rights, as best reflecting his view of the ideals of democracy. The statement goes beyond normal constitutional rights, but is no more radical than vintage New Deal rhetoric. Franklin D. Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech of January 1941, for example, made many of the same points. John Reinecke did have one modification to make in Article 10 of the statement. This article declared that everyone has the right to own property under general law. John Reinecke's amendment to the article pointed out that those who believe in socialism would interpret property as personal property not coming under the means of production. In other words, property in consumer goods. As John Reinecke's testimony continued, inevitably it turned to the question of force and violence. His response was that if the will of the people can be applied through normal democratic channels, there is certainly no need for the use of force and violence to preserve the democratic rights of the people or to extend them. In other words, he was saying that socialism was the democratic wave of the future and that it would come peacefully unless the reactionary elements seeking to retain capitalism precipitated violence. John Reinecke continued with the subject, taking a page out of Hawaii's history. In 1893, the business centers, by coup d'etat, overthrew the established government. They not only overthrew the established government, but they set up what was openly an oligarchy of a small section of the Caucasian population. A number of native Hawaiians, abetted by some of the whites, rose in rebellion against the oligarchy in 1895 and did their best to overthrow the government by force and violence. It seems to me that this was a futile and anachronistic movement, but I certainly could not blame them. If I had been living here in Hawaii at that time and had been of an age to join them, I think I would have. However, looking at it from the vantage point of history now, I should say that they would have done better to have waited for annexation. Returning to the present, John Rienecke responded to the question of whether it would be proper to use force and violence to overthrow the government in the United States. I should say most decidedly not, unless that government had become an openly fascist government, in which case I would consider it the duty of every democratic citizen and resident of the country to oppose the fascist government, just as it was the duty of every democratically minded Italian, for example, to rise against the government of Mussolini when the opportunity offered itself, and just as thousands of Italians did rise in the partisan movement. Only under those circumstances, those very extreme circumstances, would an American citizen be justified in exercising force and violence, it appears to me. Before the conclusion of direct examination, John Rienecke was asked to evaluate his own loyalty to the United States. I think that my whole life speaks, as a testimonial to my loyalty, that within the limits of my capacity, I have taken an active part in community affairs, in movements and organizations which have tried to extend democracy in a territory which had a very imperfect democracy. During the past war, I believe that my conduct was equally loyal and patriotic to that of any other citizen of the territory. It seems to me that the charge was drawn with one eventuality in view, a war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, just as the loyalty of the Japanese Americans of Hawaii was suspect before 1941 and there was nothing they could do about it in the face of prejudice, I suppose that there is nothing which I can do affirmatively in the face of the charges that have been aimed at me except to further demonstrate my loyalty in everyday life. As a citizen of the community, the last gesture of the defense was to seek to take the wind from the sails of the Territories Council by asking John Rienecke if he were a member of the Communist Party. Rienecke's response was to read a statement made by Ring Lardner Jr. before the House Committee on Un-American Activities during the committee's 1947 investigation of communism in the film industry. In that statement, Lardner had quoted Thomas Jefferson, who said, "It is time enough for the rightful purposes of civil government for its officers to interfere when principles break out into overt acts against peace and good order." With this, the defense concluded its case. Deputy Attorney General Blatt wanted John Rienecke to make a statement on his membership in the Communist Party in his own words. John Rienecke's reply, essentially, was that whether he was a member of the Communist Party or not was irrelevant to the question of whether he possessed the ideals of democracy. Silva told John Rienecke that he was usurping the authority of the commissioners by stating what was relevant and what was not. The chairman pressed on. "I would like to put the question this way," Silva said. "Do you deny that you are now or ever have been a member of the Communist Party of the United States? And what is your answer then to that, Doctor?" "I neither deny nor affirm," John Rienecke responded, "that I am now or ever have been a member of the Communist Party of the United States, and my answer is based on the same reasons which I have already given." There was one piece of new and dramatic evidence which was raised during John Rienecke's cross-examination. It was a letter which Samuel Weinman, author of the pamphlet Hawaii, A Story of Imperial Plunder, had written to John Rienecke. It was dated May 29, 1935, and opened with the salutation, "Dear Comrade Rienecke." Weinman asked a number of questions about Hawaii, prompted by the critique John Rienecke had written on Weinman's pamphlet. He also made reference to the group, which seemed related to John Rienecke's earlier correspondence. Weinman went on to ask, "Has the group formulated their ideas as to what is the next step in Hawaii?" Weinman's conclusion left no doubt as to his understanding about the nature of the group and the existence of a Communist Party organization in Hawaii. "We have discussed linking the Hawaiian movement to the one in the United States. We plan to do something definite about it shortly. It would be well if you could get this letter into the hands of the Communist Party group and have them communicate with us directly, telling us what we can do specifically to aid them." The letter was signed fraternally S. Weinman. With regard to the major question raised by the letter, the existence of a Communist Party in 1935, John Rienecke insisted that Weinman had jumped to conclusions. The group, which had a definite Marxist orientation, was identified as the Committee on Youth Opinion, led by John K. Akow, Jr., whom John Rienecke had earlier identified as one of the men to whom he had given a copy of What Must We Do. In a recent interview, John Rienecke described Weinman as a sanguine young man in his early 20s who had arrived at his conclusions and did not want to be confused by facts. This is supported in John Rienecke's testimony in 1948. Rienecke, well, Mr. Weinman was a resident of New York, and there's an old chestnut about leaflets being issued back in the 22nds addressed to the workers and peasants of Brooklyn. Maybe he was one of them. I think that this is further evidence that Mr. Weinman had a stereotype of what a colony should be like, peasantry and all. And this was after I had written to him telling him specifically that we had no peasantry here but that we had plantation agriculture. But he still couldn't get through his head that there wasn't a peasant class. Blatt, so you had to go to New York to edify him. Rienecke, no, I did not go to New York to edify him. I went through New York on the way to edify myself. Blatt knew he had struck a rich vein, and he worked it assiduously. There can be no doubt that the letter was damaging. Another piece of damaging evidence was the disclosure that John Rienecke had written articles in the Kauai Herald just prior to World War II under the assumed name of N.K. Dewey. Footnote: Dr. Rienecke revealed the source of the name to the author in an interview on June 5, 1973. Using English characters, the Chinese phonetic spelling of Rienecke's last name is Dewey Nai Kea. Footnote end. The articles disclosed an author who could have been categorized as a fairly radical malcontent. He was against martial law. He wanted to stop fascism abroad, but not at the cost of fascism at home. He attacked racism in the military. Most damaging, as late as June 2, 1941 he was taking the position that the United States should not enter the war in Europe, a position taken by the Communist Party in the United States from the time of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact on August 23, 1939 to the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. John Rienecke admitted at the hearing that his thinking on the matter of the European war had substantially followed the Communist Party line, but contended that, unlike the party, the transitions in his thinking had come gradually. But there is no gainsaying the fact that the Dewey articles were damaging to John Rienecke's defense. Nor did Rienecke win any friends among the commissioners when Chairman Silva questioned him about the Fifth Amendment. Silva was referring to that part of the Fifth Amendment which dealt with the confiscation of property without just compensation, not the part dealing with self-incrimination. When John Rienecke was asked how he could reconcile this with his views on property, he replied, I don't think it is necessary to reconcile it because I have always been under the impression that the Constitution of the United States can be amended. Commissioner John Owens continued with the property theme, using a different line of attack. He asked John Rienecke if he had ever read the Bible. After an affirmative reply, Owens asked John Rienecke if he recalled reading the Ten Commandments. John Rienecke grew wary. Rienecke, I have some faint recollection of reading it. Owens, I was wondering in carrying along with your line of reasoning there about what I will call confiscation of property, especially in those instances where they are means of production, how you would reconcile the Seventh Commandment, Thou shalt not steal, to your line of reasoning of taking these means of production without compensation. Rienecke, I don't suppose that you want me to go into a long lecture on the history of morals, but I should say that the concept of theft and the concepts of property have changed a great deal from time to time. For example, unless I am greatly mistaken, it was at one time thought to be confiscatory to take property as an inheritance tax or as a gift tax, and I am afraid that some people who would like to inherit or receive large sums of money as gifts still think that. In other words, the concepts of property and concepts of theft that existed among Hebrews 1000 years BC, or whenever it was in the concepts of property and concepts of theft that exist among the Americans in 1948 are somewhat different. Owens, well, would you say then that the concept of religion, there has been a change in the meaning or the application of the Ten Commandments then? Rienecke, oh, undoubtedly. Anybody who has the slightest smattering of history and of sociology knows that. When Silva reminded John Rienecke that he had been the recipient of a Carnegie Foundation fellowship and asked him what he would do about the Carnegie Foundation if the United States became a socialist nation, Rienecke's response was that he would be pleased to do some research on student financial aid in socialist countries for the chairman. And so the cross-examination of John Rienecke continued. Interspersed with Rienecke's witty, if self-defeating, exchanges were a number of heavy-handed efforts on the part of the Territories Council to get John Rienecke to commit himself or an associate on the matter of membership in the Communist Party. Asked about his unwillingness to discuss fully his political beliefs with the commissioners, John Rienecke replied, I should say that I have given a much fuller summary of them than I feel the board is in right entitled to. John Reinecke's cross-examination ended on a note of near absurdity. Blatt insisted that he was hypocritical in withholding information about his possible association with the Communist Party on the grounds that his politics were his own business. After all, Blatt reasoned, hadn't John Reinecke freely admitted being a member of the Democratic Party? Seeing the logic, or the absurdity, of the statement, John Reinecke retracted his earlier admission and declared, "I will neither affirm nor deny that I am a member. I would say that if the board came around with a set of charges to show that by reason of my membership in the Democratic Party, alleged membership, I was not possessed of the ideals of democracy and that I was of doubtful loyalty to the government, I should certainly decline to discuss my alleged membership in the Democratic Party." Before putting Aiko Reinecke on the stand, Meyer Simmons decided to edify Jack Owens with a Marxist interpretation of the Ten Commandments. He quoted from a book called Socialism and Ethics by a one-time philosophy professor from Brooklyn College, Howard Selson. Some of the moral questions raised included whether or not the confiscation of American oil properties and subsoil rights in Mexico had been stealing on the part of the Mexican government, whether or not the Emancipation Proclamation was stealing, whether or not the Russian revolutionists had stolen the private property they confiscated, whether or not stealing was involved in the Protestant Reformation when the property of the Catholic Church was confiscated, were such acts as these contrary to God's eternal law as expressed in the Eighth Commandment. Either a yes or no answer to this question requires the interpretation of the commandment in terms of more fundamental moral principles and thus reveals their limited and relative moral character. Simmons continued with the assertion that the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," had always been treated relatively, that no society of any historical significance had truly observed it. He also cited Selson's contention that monogamous marriage originated more as a means of orderly property inheritance than out of a timeless moral principle. With this, Chairman Silva could stand no more and ended the discussion with the statement that I'm sure that everyone in this room has been taught since the cradle that it's wrong to steal. It was wrong to steal in the days of the Israelites and it's wrong today. When Aiko Reinecke took the stand, she was led through her direct testimony by Harriet Bauslag. Aiko Reinecke described her young life, a life distinctively shaped by Hawaii's plantation economy. Born of immigrant parents, Aiko Reinecke went to work in the fields at the age of 11 for 50 cents a day. She described the very rustic camp conditions, the loving influence of a teacher, Mrs. Sisson, who had a great impact on Aiko Reinecke's subsequent life, the family and personal sacrifice involved in gaining a high school education, the ultimate success of graduation from the territorial normal and training school where Aiko Reinecke trained to become a teacher, the struggle to support her family when her father was laid off by Libby, McNeil and Libby after 15 years of service, without a pension of any kind, at the age of 66. A year after her father was laid off, Aiko Takamasa married John Reinecke, and confronted a very different life than she had known before. With her husband, Aiko Reinecke visited the mainland for the first time and was impressed with the vastness of it all while she was, at the same time, shocked by the results of the Depression. Together, John and Aiko Reinecke went to New Haven and savored an intellectual climate she had never known before. Together, they went to the South and learned something of the racial injustice which then prevailed in that part of the country. And together, the Reineckes went to Mexico in 1941, broadening their social perspectives still further. In 1938, Aiko Reinecke learned that being married to a radical had its hardships. John Reinecke's firing by the University of Hawaii was a heavy blow for the family. The couple gave up their home and moved in with Aiko Reinecke's family. And now, Aiko Reinecke was finding anew the hardship of life with a radical. If John Reinecke were considered guilty by association with the Communist Party, Aiko Reinecke's guilt came by association with her husband. Over time and through her own experiences as well as the influence of her husband, Aiko Reinecke had developed a political philosophy which she described in her testimony. When Harriet Bauslag asked her about it, she replied, "Well, that's a very difficult question. I haven't really done a great deal of reading and thinking to have formulated a philosophy, but I have been puzzled by the contradictions that I have run into and the problems that I have met in my private life as well as in the lives of my students. As I said earlier, I've experienced the layoff of my father, his unemployment, my husband's unemployment, and I have lived through 2 world wars. Also, I remember vividly the depression, the poverty and the squalor and worry of the period. And so, for many years, I've been trying to get at the root of all this evil, poverty, unemployment, and insecurity. I feel that these things are part of the system under which we live and that if we had a different kind of system which would give people better livelihood, more security, and the good things of life, that it would be better than what we have today. I feel that if we socially own the things that must produce the necessities of life, then perhaps we would have a happier life on this earth. Since the Celeste Stractor, the Rienecki hearing had received remarkably little attention in the newspapers. Eiko Rienecki's testimony released a substantial amount of latent hostility in Hawaii. Debate focused on the letter of a woman named Alice Carlson. An interesting letter. It is printed here in substantially the same form as it appeared in the Honolulu Advertiser. Eiko Rienecki and I have quite a lot in common. She is a schoolteacher, so am I. She taught school for $119 per month. My first-year teacher salary in Hawaii was $120 per month. Her parents, I assume, came from Japan. Mine came from Sweden, though not as contract labor. According to her testimony, when a child, Eiko worked in pineapple fields for 50 cents a day. I, when a child, picked mustard in Minnesota grain fields for exactly 50 cents per day. She went to the mainland in 1932, the Depression period, and learned there were beggars in our America. She didn't say she saw beggars. In 1933 I went to Japan and saw many beggars. Old women and old men and children at temple doors with thin outstretched hands. That wasn't depression in Japan, merely a normal condition. In December 1933, after a tour around the world, I traveled the mainland coast to coast on my return to Hawaii. I saw no beggars. Panhandlers, yes, but they're a different breed. But I saw a huge relief program in full swing, our America doing its utmost to help the unemployed. Didn't Eiko Rienecki on her mainland trips in 1932 and 1935 see the PWA, the CCC, the WPA, and NYA and still other employment relief projects in full swing? Strange that she mentions only the bad she saw, not a word of the good. Regarding her work in plantation fields, Eiko stated, I should like children to be children while they are children and not forced to earn wages in order to go to school. Apparently Eiko still harbors a resentment that she had to work for wages when a child. I have no resentment. I know that the all-day picking mustard in grain fields put health and strength in my growing body, and the many jobs I worked at all through high school and college gave me rich experience, better character, and deep appreciation that in America school doors were not closed to me. In many countries, you know, Eiko, no matter how ambitious you are, no matter how hard you work, you wouldn't have a chance at even a high school education, much less a college education. If today anyone should ask me my political beliefs or party allegiance, I would not, like Eiko, refuse to answer on the grounds that my constitutional right to keep silent is being transgressed. I can answer in a firm and proud voice, in that Eiko Rienecki and I have nothing in common. The contrast between the statements of Eiko Rienecki and Alice Carlson demonstrates the subtle complexity of contending philosophies at a time when polarities were the order of the day. It speaks to the issue of the relativity of moral codes, an issue defense counsel had raised the very morning Eiko Rienecki began her testimony. It captures some of the genuine tension of the time. The cross-examination of Eiko Rienecki demonstrated nothing more than the fact that she had been suspended from her teaching position for no reason other than being the wife of John Rienecki. After more than 6 weeks, after 32 days in session, the Rienecki hearing was ended. The transcript of the proceeding ran to 3,934 pages when it was completed, and the Rieneckis, who had waited almost 10 months since their suspension, waited once more. Final arguments were set for October 13, 1948, to give defense counsel time to study the transcript and to allow Meyer Simmons to meet a commitment in San Francisco.